once again, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Lauren McQuistion. I am a third-year PhD candidate in the Constructed Environment program here at the University of Virginia. And I'm very excited to have you all here for the third event in an ongoing series we have going called Meaning Methods in the Future of the Constructed Environment. It's been a discussion series that's brought together scholars, designers, practitioners, and students to explore the necessity and potentials of interdisciplinarity in the study of the constructed environment. And tonight's event, which has been co-planned and is co-hosted with Lunch, the School of Architecture's student-run design journal, has been organized around an exploration of the evolving practices of writing, editing, and publishing as vital forms of critical inquiry and powerful tools in projecting new futures for the built environment. So in the spirit of CE+'s interdisciplinary approach to scholarly research and Lunch's role publishing a broad variety of theory, history, criticism, experimentation, design, and artwork each year, we'll be discussing— Here's what I found. Ooh, sorry, my watch. We'll be discussing the role of writing as a critical praxis with artist, designer, and architectural historian Esther Choi and design critic Alexandra Lang.
Yeah, I'm Samantha Sigmon, and I'm a second year in the Masters of Architectural History program. And I also serve as one of the editors of Lunch 16 with a great team who I see some are here, which is awesome. And we're all currently editing and designing around our theme of dissent. As Lauren mentioned, Lunch is our student-led design journal for the School of Architecture at the university. And through the publication process, we foster hybrids of theory, history, practice, and representation, and encourage our contributors, who includes that can include students, faculty, and national and international professionals, academics, and critics, to take risks, push boundaries, and ask questions through their submissions.
So we will start with presentations from our two guests, and then we'll follow that with a discussion and a Q&A. And so as you have questions that come up during the presentations, please add them to the chat. And we're looking forward to having that discussion. So first up is Esther Choi. She's a multidisciplinary artist and architectural historian based in New York City. Her scholarly work explores how the domestication of nature by scientific and cultural workers throughout modern and post-war European history was crucial to the reproduction of inequality. Choi is also interested in the overlaps between art, pedagogy, and social practice. She's the founding director of Office Hours, a nonprofit mentoring initiative featuring notable and emerging BIPOC design practitioners in group conversations, which has been attended by over 1,500 BIPOC designers worldwide. Choi's work has been exhibited internationally and written about in T, the New York Times Style magazine, 032C, Vanity Fair, Vogue, and more. She's the co-editor of Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else, published by MIT Press in 2010, and Architecture is All Over by Columbia University Press in 2017. Her essays have appeared in Art Forum, Architectural Review, and Art Papers. Esther, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you everyone for coming, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and with Alexandra today about writing. So let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. You see that, yeah? Okay. So I've done I do a lot of different things, which is something I should probably figure out how to make more linear. But I think what I thought I would do today is just really quickly go through the kinds of range of methodologies, formats, and audiences that my writing and editorial projects have engaged, and sort of the different voices as well that the work can embody, or different audiences that can kind of speak to. So first, did that slide advance? Yeah, okay, great. So this is sort of, I think, a very broad cross-section of the kinds of things that I do that, revolve around sort of text and discourse in some way. I'm trained as a historian. I came to architectural history and theory through my art practice. So after doing my MFA in photography, I pursued an master's in design studies in history theory at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and then my PhD at Princeton University. And I've always been really interested by the omissions of modern and post-war cultural history. In other words, a desire to understand why certain voices and practices have been diminished from historical canons, the consequences of these erasures in the present day, and also how new narratives can be reimagined from these margins. I'm interested in how definitions of identity and subjectivity can operate as modes of exclusion in particular. This is something that I've been kind of a concern I've had even since like my undergraduate studies. If I think back on this, although it's kind of played out in different formats and different media. And basically my scholarship for the past 8 or 9 years has explored the intersections between architecture and art and the life sciences. So in particular, my dissertation, which is I'm now working on reformatting into a book manuscript, explored how the domestication of nature by scientific and cultural workers throughout modern and post-war European history was really crucial to forming the notion of an idealized modern subjectivity and also the reproduction of inequality. So that's something that we could get into in further detail, but I thought what I would do though is just sort of leave it at that for now. And some historical and theoretical references that inform both my historical work and also my sort of work in theory or criticism would be, I look to new historicism a lot, which is where I take this term, rewriting history from the margins. Thinking about sort of the marginal, the marginalized, literal margins, and thinking of ways in which to kind of invert that relationship. I'm also heavily influenced by, to totally date myself, like cultural materialism, like the work of folks like, Raymond Williams, who, I think if this was like the 90s right now, we would all be nodding our heads, but I think he sort of lost favor in American academia to a certain degree. I'm like my bread and butter always is intersectional Black feminism. That was sort of something I grew up with in my teens, which I sort of looked to make sense of my own experience. But I think a lot of Black feminist theory has been foundational to my understanding of the world and sort of like my analysis of it, as well as a lot of eco-Marxist feminist thought, like so folks like Donna Haraway, et cetera, that have also been really important references for me. In terms of my art and design criticism, these are some images of sort of publications I've contributed to. Some persistent themes that really drive my work are first, the representation of marginalized perspectives. So again, looking at omissions of representation, whether it's, and these can kind of take place even in things like exhibition reviews or, book reviews, for example. I'm also really interested in recuperative histories. I'm interested in political ecology. So I'm right now working on a collection of essays about the social, ethical, and aesthetic dimensions of what it really means to design nature in a climate changed world. So that's something that I've been kind of working on an ongoing basis. I've written about, works of art and design that operate at the juncture of what we could call social practice or socially engaged practice. And also a kind of favorite of mine in a way is writing about institutional critique. And I'm particularly interested in episodes in which architects have engaged in forms of institutional critique, because I think that discourse and that history has really been studied in really, really interesting ways in the art world, but not so much within architecture. I have, as Lauren mentioned, whoops, I meant to go to a different slide. Sorry. Did I go too far? There we go. I've edited 2 books, Architecture's All Over and Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else, both co-edited with Marika Trotter. I love editing books. They're labors of love. It's a bit like herding cats when you have like 20 contributors, but I just find it incredibly rewarding as an opportunity to create a platform to convene conversations that otherwise may never have happened, but also to chart the course of sort of architectural discourse, to kind of reinscribe certain ideas or kind of put a spotlight on certain ideas that I find really important politically or socially. So Interestingly, Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else actually began as a fanzine that I started at the GSD, which we can talk about later. But yeah, both projects have been opportunities to try to have intergenerational voices. So a lot of young authors, or at the time were sort of emerging authors. So Architectures All Over took many years to come out, which again, we can talk about later. But a lot of the historians, for example, that are featured in the book have now gone off to kind of write incredible books and, have really just, really sort of like come into their careers. And so we were really lucky to work with so many wonderful people. And I also have published books that are actually artist books. So this is an artist book called Le Corbuffet that was published by Prestel in 2019. And this is an artist project that actually adopts the form of a cookbook as a kind of culture hacking experiment. And so I'm just bringing this in because it's, there's a lot of text in this book, but again, it's a very different kind of writing and a very different way of writing about history and putting forth historical and theoretical ideas about art and design production in a very particular format. So on the left, you'll see this menu of a dinner that was convened for Walter Gropius in London that I found in the archives when I was actually doing my dissertation research, how many, 6 years ago now. And that sort of led to this interest in thinking about fluxus and action scripts and also process art and the way that recipe formats mirrored instruction sets as a way for me, like a vehicle to question the narratives that we choose to consume or reproduce. So the book is full of puns intentionally, but what's interesting about this project for me, at least, is that it totally hit the cultural water supply, and it was taken up by all these mainstream media outlets that I don't think were really aware of what the project really was, which was interesting. But I just bring this up because the text had to be able to communicate to a mainstream audience, which is very different kind of mindset that I'm operating in than when I have to, for example, write a peer-reviewed historical essay. So just to close, as an extension of sort of my editorial experience, actually, I really enjoy cultural programming that brings conversations or perspectives that I don't see happening into the public view. And so for the past, I guess, like 12, 13 years now, it's just kind of crazy to think about, I've been engaging in a lot of sort of like, cultural programming that I just sort of do because I just really selfishly just want to see these conversations happen. I've worked with institutions like MoMA and eFlux and even the TIFF Bell Lightbox in Toronto to hold these free events about aspects of design culture, in a kind of public arena. And so given that I've sort of been engaging with sort of public programming on this level, just sort of as a part of my practice, I guess, I started this online mentoring initiative called Office Hours last July, which is for students and emerging designers that identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the format of an office hour session, we had one earlier today with Samaya Valley from Counterspace, is a little bit like a classroom meets chat room, which is now in its second season of programming. And as Lauren mentioned, we've now had about 2,000 folks from over 13 countries attend these sessions, which are free. And I always really believe that discourse should be free. But really, I think for me, it's a kind of a different mode of discursive engagement that, textual engagement, for me, I kind of see that sort of as analogous. So yeah, so I think that's where I'll end my little presentation. I didn't really get into pedagogy so much, but I find that pedagogy is sort of embedded within all of these different things that I do, which again, we can talk about later.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. That was such a exciting taste of your work. And I know that we look forward to discussing with you more for sure. But next we are going to hear from Alexandra Lang about her practice. Alexandra is a design critic whose essays, reviews, and profiles have appeared in numerous design publications, including Architect, Harvard Design Magazine, Metropolis, and T Magazine, as well as in The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. She has been a featured writer at Design Observer and opinion columnist at Zine and the architecture critic for Curved. She has also taught design criticism at the School of Visual Arts and New York University. Her latest book, The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids, was published by Bloomsbury, USA in June 2018. She is currently working on a new book about the history and future of the American shopping mall, which sounds super interesting. So Alexandra, we are thrilled to have you and hear more about your work.
Great, thanks so much for having me. And it's great to meet Esther, even only by Zoom, because I think we have a lot of panel friends in common. Let me just share my screen with you. And it's interesting to me, I feel like, is that working? Okay, I feel like Esther and I picked a similar format, though hers is much better designed, of like many covers to suggest much work that has been done, because the covers are more interesting than looking at representative pages of words. So the event organizers today asked me to speak for like 10 minutes about my work, which honestly always makes me squirm because I really want you to read my work. I consider myself a much better writer than speaker. And I'm always like, read my work and then I never have to talk about it again. But that's not really how the modern world works. And I've been a working journalist for more than 20 years. And the hallmark of writing that kind of criticism is kind of an eternal forgetting. You write, you submit, you publish, and then you move on to a new topic. And the one time I got to meet one of my criticism heroes, Ada Louise Huxtable, I actually asked her whether she worried about whether her criticism, over the decades agreed with itself. Like, was that something she thought about? Did she go back and look at her work and say, okay, am I agreeing with myself of 10 years ago when I say X, Y, Z, about a new building? And she told me two things. One, like, you can't keep agreeing with yourself because criticism is as altered by changes in society as we are as people. And second, that you have to have faith that your internal values, the values that are motivating you as a writer, will carry over from one topic to the next, even subliminally. And her criticism, written for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal over really like a 40-year career, mostly stuck to the built world. But I think as we head further into the 21st century, it would be a disservice to design, a broader category than architecture, to only focus on how buildings meet the city as she did. Our experience of the built world is now highly mediated, and so too is our experience of critics. So in creating this first slide to tell you about my work, I realized that I had to start with 3 virtual places: Twitter, my website, and Instagram, because my tweets and my public speeches and the photos I take for Instagram are really all part of critical praxis today. And then in creating a slide to show you some of my most recent work, I realized that I was going to be showing you a podcast about Instagram, a story about adaptive reuse of malls, which was prompted by Twitter, and a story about teen space, a topic I keep returning to, but in this case, it was teen space that is entirely digital and better for it. And I really believe that like one of the most important qualities of the critic is openness. And if design criticism has a future as a field, it has to maintain that openness to new and more diverse voices, to new definitions of the built environment, to new definitions of the design environment, and also to new media as a way of conveying criticism. I mean, I love writing essays. And when I taught criticism, I always taught my students that you could do a lot in 1,500 words. But I also love to just chat about design, which is mostly the mode I'm in when I'm on Twitter. And I also love to show people what's good and that there's, good architecture and good landscape everywhere, which is mostly my mode on Instagram. And I think each of those ways of communicating has its place and its purpose, and indeed a different audience. And the most fruitful writing projects in my experience are projects that connect different modes of writing and connect to a constellation of projects both before and since. So in my remaining 10 minutes, I want to show you a few of the constellations that I see my own written work in. The first is other books about shopping malls, because my book about the shopping mall, which will be published, I hope, in spring 2022, doesn't have a cover yet. So I have to show you other people's covers. I'd say that one of the ways that openness manifests itself in my own career is in choosing topics. If everyone is writing about something, I'm usually not that interested in writing about it myself. I'm not arrogant enough to feel that my voice is necessary when lots of my smart friends and fellow critics have weighed in. And I'm really more interested in picking around the edges of the built world and discovering over time the places that may seem marginal or seem dead or even seem frivolous are actually central to our experiences of the built world. And that's really how I got to my current topic, the history and future of the shopping mall. And I have lots of ideas for my own cover, featuring neon and like orange Julius stands and quarry tile. But in collecting this cover cloud of books, I realized it was really fascinating to see how other designers had interpreted the mall like as a cover topic. And as you'll see, some of these books are scholarly books, like the Harvard Design School Harvard Design School Guide to Shopping, which is there on the right with the escalator. Richard Peck's Secrets of the Shopping Mall is a late 1970s young adult novel. And I have to say that young adult authors are often on the cutting edge of cultural change. And Richard Peck was then in the same way as someone like Casey McQuistion is now, I think. Here's some more mall books. Severance and Friday Black are both fictional dystopian views of malls, while World of Malls was the first exhibition on malls in a design museum. So malls are simultaneously dead and as physical artifacts very much in need of new lives. And I think both writing their history and looking at how fiction authors have addressed malls can show us how to use them in the future. Just a few more mall books. William Kowinski's book, The Mauling of America, was published in 1985, and it was the first serious look at where malls came from and what they had wrought on the American landscape. It remains fascinating to me that it took basically 30 years of enclosed shopping malls for them to be taken seriously enough to get their own mainstream book, while Victor Gruen, whose book is on the right, had written, all these handbooks for malls that had been read by professionals starting in the late 1950s. So, why is it that they weren't taken seriously? Because they were associated with so-called frivolous activities like shopping, they were associated with women and children, and they were associated with the suburbs rather than the ostensible center, urban downtowns. But as I believed, and I continue to believe during my research, suburbs would have been completely uninhabitable without shopping malls. So in that way, writing about shopping malls ended up taking up partially the same challenge as my previous book, The Design of Childhood. Both of them, I think, address the question, what's a design experience that almost everyone in the United States has, but probably never thought of having a history? Playgrounds were like that, and shopping malls were like that. When you get deeply into writing a book, there also ends up being a lot of extra materials when you get done with your manuscript, and that extra material can often end up spawning new projects. I wouldn't say that the two books on either side of the design of childhood happened because of mine, but I do know that my work helped make them possible. I contributed an essay on toys as furniture to Serious Play, which was basically a design of childhood deep cut, and got to hang out with my curator friends and see a lot of really fun and fascinating furniture and toys in person in the form of an exhibition that I'd only gotten to see in photographs during my research. And I wrote a letter of support for a grant and later the foreword to Designing Motherhood, which is coming out later this year. And I feel that all of these books are part of the same constellation of ideas, and contributing to the later books made what had started as a solo project feel much more collaborative. I hope that eventually my mall book will be part of a similar constellation with the mall books that I already showed you and future mall books, written by other people from other perspectives. For example, like as I've been doing my work, I realized there's a burning need for a collection of mall memoirs. And I just today, texted a friend of mine who's a publisher and was like, what about it? Like, could we do like a companion book to my book that hasn't even come out yet? The same kind of constellation happened with my book before the childhood book on criticism. The structure of writing about architecture came out of the writing workshops that I was teaching at NYU and the School of Visual Arts. And now I'm honored that some of my friends and colleagues assign it in their classes on criticism in the same institutions. But I never would have written a book on criticism if I hadn't been exposed to things like the work of Ada Louise Huxtable in high school. And she was really the person who made me think that women could be architecture critics. And then after college, my husband actually gave me the book Exquisite Corpse by Michael Sorkin. And he was the one who made me realize that criticism could be funny. Both of them, I recently realized, hated malls. But that really meant that they were of their time and place. They were post-war critics who, for love of the city and the hatred of capitalism, couldn't really see anything good in these non-places. And lately I've been wondering if perversely I should dedicate my book to them with their most dismissive quotes about malls in the frontispiece as a way of warding off like that particular strain of boomer criticism. And alluding to how we must all kind of metaphorically kill our critical heroes. And sort of last but not least, my first book was a collaboration with another one of my heroes, Jane Thompson, the curator, editor, and planner of the Faneuil Hall Marketplace in Boston, which was my first mall experience. Our book, which is in the middle here, was an oral history of the store design research, or DR. But the whole project was a collaboration between me and Jane, between us and our designers at Pentagram, and between me and the dozens of former design research employees that I got to interview. Along the way, I got an education in 20th century retail design and in post-war design for the masses that went well beyond the confines of my architecture history education. And that process informed the essay I later wrote on Formica and plastic and high design for this book, Formica Forever. And it also informed the essay I later wrote on Alexander Gerard and the Main Street of Columbus, Indiana, in this catalog that was published by Vitra. And then again, when I started the mall book, I was like, oh, hello, I get to write about Jane Thompson this time, not as a collaborator, but as the author of Faneuil Hall and the Festival Marketplace. And Jane and her husband, Ben, end up taking up a whole chapter in the mall book. It was one of those things where I felt like I had been very stupid not to notice this like the whole time when I was thinking up the book, that I had already, in fact, like done my research for that chapter, in a project of 10 years ago. But it was also this really great feeling of affirmation to realize that, oh, I have been interested in this all along. I'm just seeing now like where that interest can take me, and how it fits into doing architecture in the year 2020 in a way that it didn't fit into doing architecture in the year 2010. So just to wrap up, the last way I want to just mention being open to new topics is it having editors who are open to even your most random ideas. I had the great pleasure of working with Kelsey Keith at Curb for 3 years, and these are 3 of the essays I wrote there, of which I'm most proud. And my pitches for these essays basically were in like one-liners on Slack. The first one I wrote was, did you know that the Field Guide to American Houses is always the best-selling architecture book on Amazon? And did you know that Virginia McAllister is a living person? Because so often we are assigned books and you sort of assume that everyone who wrote the books is old and or dead and is not somebody who's still working. And Virginia McAllister turned out to be at that time a very alive, very vital person who was trying to write a field guide to American commercial architecture. The middle story came about because I posted a picture on Twitter of the A-frame Fisher-Price dollhouse that I had just bought on Etsy for my daughter. And it turned out that a lot of other people were very, very into A-frames. And so my editors were like, go for it. The internet wants this story. And the final story of these three is the one that I'm most proud. It came about because the Noguchi Museum was doing an exhibition on Isamu Noguchi's internment camp experience, which was very interesting in and of itself, and under historicized. And I thought, let me make a list of all the other Japanese American designers I can think of and find out what they were doing during the war, because I had never read a story about that. After doing this work, I really felt like I wanted it to reach an additional audience, and I ended up pitching my piece to KCET Artbound, where it was made into an hour-long documentary, which you can look up and watch for free online. So in that way, that story also had a second life and hopefully reached a different kind of audience. So I'm going to leave this there and stop sharing my screen and get to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, really thought-provoking and so much for us to dig in with both of you all. So a reminder again to our audience that as you formulate your questions, please add them in the chat. But we might start with a couple of questions of our own that Samantha and I have been kind of thinking about in preparing for this. And so I might start with picking up on something from Esther's presentation. I'm wondering if you could possibly share a bit more about the connection between your artistic practice and your research. That as an artist, your practice often shifts between mediums, including kind of sculpture and photography and publication, and kind of challenge conventions that reframe otherwise untold narratives in that work. And so I'm wondering how your visual practice translates or informs or contributes to your transition into your more history theory focused research.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say, again, the relationship is not linear. Like I try to not use my art practice to illustrate certain historical concepts or research. But I will say that the way I described it the other day was sort of being on a little tangent, but Ed Ruscha, I saw a conversation with Ed Ruscha and Rachel Kushner, the writer, and he was really frustrated with his practice, which is crazy to think about because he's had such a amazing career. But he was saying that he just has like a jumble of ideas that are in a shaker, and you just kind of do this, and like whatever comes out, it's sort of like in some ways kind of just remixes a certain set of ideas. I really like, I love that for a lot of reasons, but I think I operate in a similar way. So for example, I'm working on a kind of series of I have a show right now with a large scale video installation that is sort of looking at process art with commoditized materials. And it's a series that looks at like post-natural materials in terms of thinking about the domestication of nature. And so it's a visual sculptural project, photographic project, but it actually, the ideas around that relate to a text that I wrote 4 years ago now for a book called Reaper, Siegfried Gideon, Richard Hamilton, which was a show of Richard Hamilton prints, his Reaper series. And the series is basically based off of Siegfried Gideon's book, Mechanization Takes Command. And I only bring that up because I wrote this essay, like the curator, Carson Chan, had invited me to write this essay for the book about kind of second natures and the way that nature is commodified in Gideon's text and the kind of narrative that he tries to promote. And it was through that writing that I started to think differently about the status of of things we think of as natural, and also things that don't look like what they actually are in terms of their origin stories, because they've been so manufactured that led to the work I'm doing now. So again, this is to say it's sort of like a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but it's but I see this as a kind of like entanglement or like a mangle of ideas, and that certain threads will come up, and then be taken up in other ways, but they don't necessarily have like a one-to-one relation in the way that, you know, I think my historical work is like quite distinct in terms of the kinds of questions it asks, and the format and the audience it tries to engage, whereas my artwork, you know, operates in terms that I think are largely in some ways not linguistic, at least that project. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but it makes sense in here somehow. I don't know but otherwise.
Absolutely.
That's great. Yeah, sort of a similar question for Alexandra and making sense somehow. So you work across many different styles and formats of writing and publication, from criticism intended for the general public to maybe a more detailed, historically based research that evolves into book projects, as you mentioned. How does navigating these shifts in tone, format, and style contribute to your writing practice as a whole? And in that similar question, how does writing for one audience affect or inform how you write, and how you kind of mix up your style if you're writing for different kinds of audiences?
Well, it's funny. I feel like the obvious answer is something like, oh, okay, like, well, my books have footnotes, but my articles do not. But of course, I am an extensive hyperlinker in my articles, which are basically footnotes. So I feel like what happens is that it all gets it's all swirling together. And then my book writing and writing for things like museum catalogs that do have to be footnoted and do have to cite precedents in a more formal way are at one end of the spectrum. And, you know, my columns, especially for digital publications, are at the other end of the spectrum in terms of the looseness of the angle of the language, you know, how many sources I use, you know, how much history is in there. But that said, like, I think, you know, I've been working on a column this week about how America's children deserve a summer of play because they've been locked up in their houses on Zoom school so long. And in researching something else, I found this amazing example that I guess I don't want to give away yet, of a historical project on like a historical open streets project, let's say. And I just like stuck that example in the back of my mind, and I've been, you know, saving it for something. And I suddenly realized, like, this is the time to get it out. This is the time where we need like a little bit of historical gravitas that, you know, I think, you know, having a PhD writing books like makes me like kind of grab for, like, will make a difference in this column, because it just, it gives the argument a depth and a sense of history that I wouldn't already have had. So, and then on the flip side, you know, I'm writing a book about the history of shopping malls, but I have a whole chapter about like teenagers in malls, and it's just filled with basically teenagers in malls from, you know, TV shows and movies and comic books and comedy routines, which is technically, you know, much more of the stuff of like pop or cultural criticism that you would see online. So it's just like, it goes back and forth, and both projects definitely inform one another.
I think I have a question maybe for both of you. You both kind of mentioned looking for projects that are at the margins, topics that are maybe not necessarily the typical narrative. And so I wonder how you have found yourselves interested in the specific subjects that you've taken up, and have, you know, how something evolves from something you're maybe interested in to something you're then interested in writing an essay on, and then maybe turning into a book. Like, for each of you, how has that process played out in some of your projects? The spark of, you know, realizing something has not been talked about and then taking it to that full length of a full-blown book. Either one of you can start.
Well, I can start. Just, I mean, because most of my writing practice is like these kind of very short, you know, essays basically for magazines. And for a while, you know, I was writing, let's say, you know, 30 of those pieces a year, what I would find was at the end of the year, I'd look back on my writing and I'd figure out that actually I wrote 3 pieces that were basically the same piece in different guises. And I was like, okay, well, so it was like my own writing, when I had a moment to stop, like revealed what I was interested in to me. And that definitely happened, you know, with the childhood book. Like there ended up being about like 6 different essays, you know, about Aldo Van Eyck, about going to see Noguchi's Playground in Japan, you know, about like summer camps, like folded into the text of what became the book. But those all started as pieces that, yeah, I might have woken up on a Thursday and been like, okay, summer's coming up. Like, what can summer camps teach us about like how children deserve like more rights to the city? So like these momentary thoughts, once they build up and once you see them in different forms, start to seem like a bigger topic and something that deserves like more of my time. And the same thing happened with malls. I wrote 3 different pieces on shopping malls and pedestrian malls for Curbed before I was like, wait a second, like, is there a book on shopping malls? You know, not really. Like maybe there's something to this. You know, the 80s is now history, and like what is more 80s than a shopping mall?
And then, yeah, Esther, if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Can I just also say, like, just take this opportunity to say, Alexandra, I so admire your ability to write quickly, like on deadline. I can't do that. I don't know. I don't even know why I'm honestly like participating in this thing, because I'm just the slowest writer, and I find writing so difficult. Like I don't even know why I do it, if I'm totally honest, because of the kind of physical pain it causes me. But in any case, I really, really admire your ability to, because I feel like I operate on geological time with deadlines. But in any case, sorry to get off track. I guess, like, if I understand the question correctly, the sort of the things that drive a project, or in terms of like that kernel of how something gets started, is they usually fall within like one of 3 categories. Things that don't make sense. So, you know, like certain kinds of narratives that have appeared again and again and again, which is actually relates to sort of my interest in science, the way that like people are always like, you know, oh yeah, and Moholy-Nagy just happened to love biology. Why? Like, why were all of these people so interested in biology in this particular historical period? It just never sufficed. And then the more you kind of like start digging into that question, the more you realize, like I was joking earlier about that like Foucauldian moment where it's like you realize, like you unmask the world and you're like, oh my God, there's some crazy stuff happening. But it's that moment of realization where there's a kind of critical aspect to sort of, you know, what a lot of folks that are really heralded might have been interested in. So it's things that don't make sense, things that make me really angry. So there's like anger pieces, which then I have learned in experience that I maybe should not send them to an editor right away, or maybe not publish that opinion piece and maybe just sit on it for a little bit. But I have been known to write those. And then third being sort of like larger philosophical questions that I have had that now being in my early 40s, I can like think back to even my undergraduate degree and sort of questions I was wrestling with, like around identity politics, around ways of thinking about subjectivity, which in weird ways, from everything from like my graduate work to like my dissertation, I was in some ways asking the same question, but through very different methodologies and different methods. So, and sort of at the end of the day, I kind of agree with Alexandra that, you know, I think I probably had like, you know, when you trace a body of work and, you know, I think I probably had like 3 ideas or something that I was trying to work out. So, but I was actually told that in my undergrad by a professor that you're probably working on one problem for the rest of, like, for the entirety of your life as a scholar, for example, which is both like exhausting, but also a little comforting. So, but yeah, so I think in that way, sometimes emotion is like such a good, not necessarily a motivator, but an indicator that something's not in alignment with either your values or there's some kind of injustice, you know? So I tend to be really kind of instinctual on that level.
Yeah, I totally feel that as someone writing a thesis right now and realizing that it's like the next step of almost what I did in my undergrad. It's just like, oh, I'm back to this, but you know, uncovering really interesting questions about that same kernel that I'm realizing I've been into for the last, 10 years, which is kind of amazing. And that you fall back into that, in different ways and discover more. I did get a question from Lizzie on my chat that I wanted to say, and it also relates a lot to a social media question that Lauren and I had too. So Lizzie asked specifically Alexandra, but I think Esther, you could also jump in if you have opinions on this as well. It's how you balance your energies on complex research-heavy book projects with the fractured kind of thinking and writing inherent in social media. Like many people, I feel conflicted about social media in academia and was wondering how you use it effectively without being overtaken by distraction.
Okay, the short answer to that is that I'm just a highly distractible person, and that's the way I work all the time. I always describe myself as a magpie, and I think that is why I am a good journalist and I can write quickly and I write about all of these sort of things, because that is what keeps my mind, that's what sparks my mind. And in fact, writing books is non-instinctual for me. So, and because I like things, to happen, and I like them to be completed, and I like them to be over. And a book can take a very long time. But if you drill down into any of my book projects, you'll see that each of the chapter has a different theme, and each chapter then is broken down into 5 or 6 sections, each one covering a different topic. And so basically it's my books are compilations of lots of essays about different topics within an umbrella topic. So I would say that honestly, luckily for my career, social media comes and came very naturally to me. And I really don't think about it that much. When I'm on Twitter, I am often in the middle of writing something. I'll write a couple of paragraphs, and then I'll want to take a little mental break, and then I'll tweet a few things, and then I'll go back to writing a few more paragraphs, and then I'll tweet. So it's very incorporated into my day. I mean, you can't see my desk setup, but I have my phone and I have a laptop and I have a giant screen. So I have basically 5 windows open at any one time. And this is my natural habitat. It's sort of freaky, but I have to say, my son is 13 and I see him doing the same thing. He can't watch TV without also looking at something on his phone. And I'm oh my God, I spawned this mini me that's also way too connected. So I feel like social media should not be difficult. And if it feels like a drain and it feels like something you're uncomfortable with, I wouldn't do it. I mean, I think, you have to figure out what you need it to do professionally. But I wouldn't still be on Twitter and I wouldn't still be on Instagram if I wasn't having a good time, if I didn't have what I felt were really positive parasocial relationships that in fact helped my work on those platforms.
Alexandra, I want to study your brain. I think I'm just
I
shaking my head.
Everyone out or something.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing that you can toggle back and forth that way, because I can't. I mean, I'm naturally predisposed to be very distractible. So I think, and I'm also, I'm very stubborn in the sense that I can only find myself really focusing energy on things that I'm actually deeply interested in, which is not good if I'm being hired to do a lot. You know what I mean? This is why I'm just amazed by how you operate and how you think. It's really amazing. I do the opposite. I've actually taken a tip from organizational psychology, whereby when I first get up in the morning I'm not always so good at it, but for the first 4 or 5 hours of my workday, I don't go on social media, and I have to restrict the amount of inputs in my brain. But I find that, because I know at least with writing, I have a maximum on a good day 5 hours that I can put in, because I'm just so again, work on geological time and trying to sift through data and whatever else I'm working on. So I have to limit what I expose my brain to. And if it's just going to be gobbledygook because I just need a breather, I try to either go for a walk or just pick something so deeply dumb that it won't compete at all in terms of content, with what I'm actually working on. But I find though that it's shaved off a huge amount of time of my workday, which is usually it can be very unproductive sometimes. And it just forces my brain to use the limited energy that it has, like to kind of resolve the question of the day in a way. But yeah, I wish I had the capability to toggle that way, because I think it would be incredible. Like, I just admire you so much in terms of like your ability. So it's interesting too, because like I like working on book projects because I buy myself more time, right? Like the life cycle of writing a manuscript is different than having to submit something to an editor for publication, and like a journal cycle or a magazine cycle. And I have a lot of social anxiety with editors, like, because I have them right now in my inbox, and people being like, where is the draft, and I'm like, oh, next Thursday, anyway, so it's not great, but I very much admire that.
I also feel that geologic time versus quick turnaround anxiety, and constantly struggle with it too. And actually, the first question in the chat kind of gets at some of these different timescales on projects and how we engage with them. So I'm going to go to our chat and a question from AJ Artemel. How do you remain engaged with current topics in discourse and criticism, even while working on long-term or larger projects? How do you balance responding to current discussion versus creating current discussion when your project debuts? So that kind of anxiety of whether you're responding to something in the moment versus having that larger format project over time.
I guess I can start with that. I mean, I definitely do not think everything about my practice is good. It's just like kind of the way it is, the way it's happened. And like one thing that I think is probably like less than perfect is that like when you are a journalist for a long time, like you really do get a dopamine hit every time something is published, and it can feel very disorienting to go, weeks, months. Well, I guess I've never gone more than months, like without having something new published. For me, like staying like somewhat involved with like what's happening via Twitter and Instagram is helpful. And one time after I'd taken like 3 months, like basically completely off to like really like do deep work on my book, I checked in with people and I was like, did you even notice that I hadn't published something? Because I was on Twitter, every day or every couple of days, like I was still chatting. I was still, I thought, involved in the discourse. And they said they hadn't really noticed, which to me showed that like there's a way of like showing up without showing up, or like showing up but limiting your exposure. So that you're there, people know you're there, people know where to find you, but in fact, like they don't know what you do all day. And it doesn't take that much to like have that amount of exposure. For me, like it's still incredibly valuable to have these longer term projects because honestly, like the criticism ecosystem is pretty fragile right now. And so is the journalism ecosystem. And I really do worry about a lot of the work I do, like, if not like completely disappearing, just becoming very difficult to find, like never getting anthologized, just like not being something that people can turn to. So for me, writing books feels like a kind of insurance that the topics that I care about and like the way that I think things need to be written about, like will be in this dead tree form that will be in libraries. And so, somebody will read it in the future.
Yeah, I don't know that I feel pressured that I have to engage with like current topics in discourse. I think I don't know. I don't feel like I need to necessarily always have I don't have a stake in everything, like I'm not interested in everything. That said, the things I'm interested in, I pay attention to. So, and if I can't, if like sometimes if I'm like a little angry on social media or something, and I'll like, I just use my stories and they'll like publish like a little thing or whatever, just to get it off my chest. And if that doesn't suffice and I feel like I really need to probe whatever the topic is in greater detail, then that usually then does lead to maybe a piece about things like sustainability's image problem, right? But I will say too that, you know, I think in some ways, maybe the ways that book writing in itself could be a totally different discussion. There are a lot of ways to write books. Like a historical study that I'm writing is different than a collection of essays, for example. So, so for the collection of essays that I'm writing on climate issues in the design fields, like that is a way actually that I can be sort of in the moment and inspired by maybe something that I've read or something that I've seen or that's happening in real time. The hope, the anxiety always is that, of course, that by the time the book comes out, that you know, it'll be like ancient history or something, but I think that's the risk you take. So, and it's also on me as a writer to be able to produce at a rate to make sure that book comes out at a certain time. But I think also that's why you see books now that are like long form essays, as opposed to sort of like the 300-400 page book of contemporary criticism. And it's precisely for that reason, especially books around the Anthropocene or climate issues, anything in the environmental humanities, you're getting these like 100-page books for that reason. So yeah, so I think, I guess, like, you know, I think there's a lot of ways you can navigate it. But I guess also too, I would just sort of wonder what in the question, even like remaining engaged, I think can take lots of different forms, and it doesn't necessarily always require that I an author something in relation to that. I might just be engaged in other ways. So yeah.
I feel like that's definitely tricky. Moving forward to our next question in the chat from David. Architecture and the larger design field often uses their visual language of understanding as a scapegoat for being not great writers. And when architects do write, it's often self-congratulatory or just too convoluted. What can you tell this young group of budding architects to encourage them to better leverage writing as a way to observe and create, or to realize that writing and criticism can be crucial forms of contributing to architecture and design?
I think, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I think I would agree that a lot of architecture writing is can be self-congratulatory and convoluted, and especially when you're starting out. I think in architecture school, like there are a lot of opportunities where you are forced to talk about your work, where you should talk about your work, and I think really trying to kind of limit the number of processes between like what you really think about your work in your head and what you say about your work out loud and on the page is going to help you. Like be as straightforward as possible in how you write. Try to make your writing align with your thinking and like your true emotions and intuitions about the work, rather than trying to filter it through somebody else's language or like the language of the authors that you're reading. And I think that also, you know, goes over not just into talking about your own work, but potentially into writing criticism. Just like trying to say what you think is actually really difficult, but is going to be the like most fruitful strategy.
Yeah, I would say that I became really interested in my art practice, interested in architecture by reading architectural theory, and in particular, architects that were writing about their own work of a certain era. And that was an era in which artists were also writing about their work, and that's sort of gone out of fashion. But those sort of architect writer or architect journalist slash artist slash writer, those kinds of combos were at one point historically much more common. And I've always found that when you read the work of an architect who is a good writer, it's always, for me, much more, not much more, but it's always incredibly satisfying, because I really appreciate when designers and artists think of their work as theorizable objects and use them as a kind of, they think about making and writing or thinking as like extensions of intellectual activity, as opposed to oppositional things. So I always try to encourage students to look at the things they're making, but also be really mindful of the difference between intention and effect. which is like the classic scenario that you get when you're at a review, for example, which is that like you can make all these proclamations about this thing that you intended, but the actual effect may be very different. And that doesn't mean that it's not interesting. Actually, sometimes the effects are really unexpected, but they're actually more interesting. So I think the question in some ways, in some ways, it's not only just about being good writers, but it's actually really about looking at your work and really paying attention to your work and trying to have some kind of distance from the work itself to be able to position it within a kind of larger discourse of production, or the larger sets of issues that you're trying to investigate. And that, for me, being able to position it within some kind of critical, conceptual, and historical framework, theoretical framework, is really what I think brings a lot of richness to the work itself.
I think that's a great point, and I think it also kind of gets at the point made earlier about taking a step back from your work and realizing that there's maybe 1, 2, 3 recurring things that you kind of have subliminally been working on in your larger collection of production, and having that perspective of actually like taking a step back enough to be able to synthesize and describe and bring your ideas together into a narrative that design and writing are really not all that separate. We're used to synthesizing a collection of projects into a portfolio that's kind of a visual narrative, but we don't always emphasize doing the same thing with our writing when we're talking in a design context. So I think that's a really interesting connection.
I think too, just to add to that the dichotomy that false dichotomy is exacerbated by education, right? So history theory courses and then studio courses over here. I've had endless discussions with architect friends who are teaching at different institutions about like reimagining what an integrated model would look like. What would it look like to have a historian, theorist person, engaging and like having small seminars with that person to lead you through some foundational text that might actually help you think through the studio in different terms and allow that kind of depth of, research. And these are really just like, it's not actually difficult to actually make that happen. So I think that siloing though is, I do think there's a bias in some ways around practice, especially, right, where it's seen, and this happens in the art world as well, that there's a kind of like bifurcation between the two, and that somehow history theory is an addendum or like in service of a bigger building project, as opposed to yet another really important set of tools and frameworks and skills that a designer really needs in order to be able to contribute meaningful work in the field. So that's my 2 cents on academia, but.
We have another question in the chat that's a long one, but I think it's worth reading. It's from Scott Mitchell, another member of the CE Plus cohort. This conversation has been hosted by Lunch, the student journal here at UVA, and CE Plus, a group of PhD students, all of whom engage with writing, publication, and praxis in very particular ways, most notably targeting design professionals, academics, scholars, and other students. Both of you, however, have found spaces outside of that academic niche. So Alexandra, you in particular have written extensively as a journalist and critic for popular publications that have broad reach. Your mention of Ada Louise Huxtable, who represented for decades this mode of architectural criticism, something between common interest journalism, public education, and biting critical criticism of architecture. As the media landscape shifts from large urban publications of record to blogs, digital magazines, podcasts, and spaces like Twitter and Instagram, how do you see your writing and your role as architecture critic and journalist? And perhaps how could we all see our writing as contributing to the culture of architecture, landscape design outside of the academy where we all exist today? And Esther, what about public programming, small groups, and exhibition? You kind of talked about making discourse public in that way as well.
I guess I should go first. Yeah, I feel like I should say that, yes, like I do have an architecture history PhD, but I always wanted to use that to be a better architecture critic. Like at no point in my life did I think I was going to go into academia after I finished my PhD. I really, yeah, I really like took the Ada Louise Huxtable model to heart, I guess, in more ways than one. And I think, and I feel like that's been borne out in that, yeah, I continue to be interested in like talking about architecture in a pop culture way, in a way where, you know, architecture criticism can be in the same section as, you know, movie reviews and music reviews, and in fact can incorporate movies and music and all of these other things into the discussion of architecture. I think that like the rise of social media has only kind of made the ways that you can like make architecture criticism, pop architecture criticism, like more multifarious. I mean, like if you look at a meme account like Dank Lloyd Wright on Instagram, like that's architecture criticism, and it's architecture criticism in the way I like, as somebody in their 40s, like as a Gen Xer, like it would never occur to me to like make work like that. And I find myself like constantly kind of admiring like a lot of the younger people that I'm in conversation with, because like I, you know, it's like I am still trying to write an essay, and like maybe the essay is over, but like that's the form that I understand best and like think I'm best at. But I can completely admire and see that, and I think you can see like projects in parallel with something like Dank Lloyd Wright, you know, with people who do other like funny memes on Twitter, and really like having all of these different kinds of architecture discourse like on these super popular and super public platforms is ultimately to the good of both the architecture profession and the criticism profession, because criticism in the old Ada Louise Huxtable way is really threatened. Like I think that if you know, people my age and younger than me that want to be critics don't find these other like mediums and methods, that, you know, you can't do it the way that that you could in the 90s, basically.
I do like lament sort of the I wouldn't say it's the loss, but like I miss the long form essay a lot. Like, you know, just because you're talking about Ada Louise Huxtable, and you know, there's a kind of like format of the long form essay that certain publications still are really champion, you know, the one review of books kind of model. And I miss that a lot. I wish we could have that in our field. I will say, I don't know if I'm really answering the question, but I think my interest in creating platforms outside of academia is totally intentional. I think, frankly, I'm not even saying like I'm championing the most interesting ideas, but I think the most interesting ideas happen outside of the academy. Sorry, I'm probably offending people, but I think, you know, it also like to not have to answer to people and to be able to program anything that I want, if I can find the money to do it, is like hugely liberating and exciting to me. And my hope is with things like office hours that, you know, because it's a very skills-based, practical programming series, that, you know, we have sessions about how to start a magazine, you know, and my hope is that actually like the 100 people of color that attend our sessions per session will like all run off and start their own platforms, right? Because I think that's how culture like renews itself. And I think there's huge power in the kinds of platforms that Alexandra writes for, in terms of like shifting public consciousness around certain issues, you know, and it's hugely powerful in a mainstream way. And I think actually, instead of having the most, you know, academia, and I can say this as like a, you know, full-fledged academic, like, you know, academia likes to pride itself as being the place of like veritas, you know, like the most cutting edge ideas are happening here first and foremost, and then it's like trickle down into like quotidian life or something. But I actually think it's the opposite. I think things that are happening in the public realm, like kind of mass cultural movements, are actually, you know, they actually have an effect on academia in shifting certain kinds of conservative attitudes, for example. So I don't know, maybe I'll get in hot water for saying that, but for that reason, I'm always super into DIY kind of attitudes around it, self-initiated platforms, spaces, projects, etc. And I think it can only help and also like as Alexandra pointed out, like renew the formats and forms of criticism and writing and historical inquiry and all those things, so that they're not only a peer-reviewed article by like read by 3 people, you know, including the editor of the publication, right? And the writer and like the writer's partner or something. Like, so and yeah, I think there's a lot of power to being able to write for large audiences, and I think that that's a shift in values that not all academics, for example, are like appreciate, but I really appreciate being able to communicate complex ideas in ways that are totally accessible. You know, so I don't know, I'm kind of going on a tangent, but I think yeah, that's sort of what I would say to that. So you know, David, start your own something, right? And I'm seeing new publications pop up, you know, all the time. And I think this is also like an opportunity to reimagine, likewise, like new cultural institutions, like new granting organizations, new, you know, new ways of engaging with as a way to kind of solve some of these pipeline problems and funding problems that have been really prohibitive in creating inclusive spaces, inclusive, you know, an array of different voices, right, to be able to engage in conversation together. So yeah, I mean, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's so true. Alexandra, just this is a funny thing that you mentioned, the sort of memes, and it made me realize I'm in, Lizzie's actually in this class too, a pretty intense art history seminar where it's like a lot of critical theory reading, you know, at once on aesthetics. And I always go to Instagram and look at my like philosophy joke memes to make sure I kind of understand. If I think it's funny, I'm like, okay, I might get a bit of this 100 pages because thank goodness for Instagram and their philosophy jokes. So that's been very helpful, I'm realizing on there. Let's get to David's, I think it's sort of a follow-up on sort of what Esther was talking about, thoughts on the fragility of criticism, staffing critics, and its impact to real public and institutional space. For example, the recent, now rescinded executive order by the previous administration and the National Civic Art Society to return to classical architecture as a default style of federal architecture. We're getting in it now, yeah.
Okay, I have to say that the whole like Trumpist classical architecture thing was a news story that I let pass me by because many of my friends did write excellent things about why it was absurd, how like classical architecture in America has very racist roots, how we can't build like that anymore anyway, how the whole thing was basically, you know, grandstanding and was never going to happen anyway. So, I mean, I don't know what to say about that because I feel like it's been thoroughly debunked. And it was basically like a meme like provocation just to like, you know, make the art and architecture communities except for the small like group of true believers in classical architecture, very, very angry. So, I mean, it worked, like so much ink was spilled over it and then it went away. And I feel like it should just like go away and stay there. I mean, on the fragility of criticism, again, like, I guess in the same way, like, I'm sort of frustrated by that question because I don't actually feel like I have that much power to do anything about it. You know, I try to support, you know, through, you know, writing, speaking, sometimes donating, you know, new initiatives like the new Architecture Writers Initiative and Critical Minded that are trying to like diversify the pipeline for the architecture profession. But like the problem with like the future of architecture criticism, like in newspapers and major magazines, is like this very, very large problem of journalism. And it sort of feels like, you know, no matter, no matter how well I write, like I can't fight the forces of like the loss of advertising and digital media and predatory private equity. So I have to hope that new platforms will embrace architecture criticism, especially if younger critics, know how to write for those platforms and those audiences. And I also think that certain kinds of foundations should step in and not just support books and kind of old-fashioned institutionalized ways of supporting like the future of architecture writing, but think about supporting individual critics who just want to write a lot of essays or who just like need a little extra income boost to continue the practice. And I don't know, I got into a whole Twitter discussion about like how awards and fellowships and all of those things are structured recently. And I think I said this at some point that, yeah, just the idea that there could be a way to support people doing good work at not forcing them to do a different kind of work, but to just like keep them doing that good work with, less precarity and a better income, like would be tremendously helpful. And I hope, things like the MacArthur Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Graham Foundation, those kinds of foundations can start to think about how they could formulate an award like that.
I echo that. I was like giving you an invisible standing ovation because I think, but also like arts writers I can think off the top of my head of like a few different kinds of outlets that will support arts writers in that way, in terms of just the kind of breadth of their career. Not so much architecture writers for sure, and design writers for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with the commissioning institutions of our fields, specifically that there's a kind of championing around certain kinds of production for sure, and not understanding. I don't think most people really think about the ways in which like, criticism, writing, curatorial work supports this kind of larger ecosystem of production. It's always seen as sort of secondary. So yeah, I would really echo that. I don't totally, if I'm honest, I don't totally understand David's like the fragility of criticism, staffing critics. I don't know that I totally understand the question, if I'm honest. Yeah, I don't know if like David's able to, or maybe I'm just missing something that's really obvious. So I'm just gonna sort of stop speaking now because a lot of what Alexandra said made sense, but I don't think I totally understand. Yeah, I don't totally understand the question.
Yeah. So I know we're kind of getting close to our time, and this has just been wonderful and so interesting. I did want to kind of have us end on like hopefully a hopeful note with one last question for both of y'all. So thinking about like the future of writing in design criticism and publication on the built environment, is there something that what excites you the most about this future of what you all do moving forward? Where do you still get all the feels, the good feels for it?
Well, I would say, I mean, one thing that Esther mentioned earlier was that there are a lot of new design publications like popping up all the time. And every time I see one, I'm like amazed by the quality of design and production and like thoughtfulness that went into it as a package. I feel like, we have the means today to make publications that really speak at like both a visual and verbal level. And like one of the things that like architects should do well is be able to speak both, visually and verbally. Like I think that going back and forth like can be one of the strengths of the profession. And I know I always describe myself as like a visual person who happens to be a writer. And I feel like that's one of my strengths as a writer. So I feel like the possibilities of current both physical and digital technology like open up a lot of new avenues for talking about work and being critical work in like different ways. And again, like that should help that should help us as, like as a collective, the architectural profession, like connect with new audiences and continue to like stay relevant.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think I'm like eternally invigorated by seeing the work of young writers, architects, designers, cultural makers, and in particular, like the reimagining of different formats or the co-opting of different formats. Like I'm super into culture hacking, like on any level. Like inspires me to no end. And I think that, sort of like Seth Price wrote in his dispersion essay from 2002, that sort of like production is not really this was again, now almost 20 years ago, but production is not necessarily the main aims or mode of critical engagement, but now it's actually about like operating within distribution systems and circulation networks. And for that reason, I'm always saying to students, like, can't you like retool Instagram? Can't you retool these formats that are free, that are sort of like out there in the world, and kind of like do that situationist thing of like, like overtaking them, turning them over, like inverting it in some ways. And I'm sorry again for anyone that's like knows that Seth Price essay, and I probably kind of butchered my synopsis of it. But in any case, like, but I find like those kinds of interventions super invigorating and inspiring. And I'm always trying to get young people to like, not necessarily try to spend all of their time trying to only operate within existing channels, but actually try to reimagine, study the channels, but then reimagine like new ones, right? Like create new platforms, like new publications, but also the ones that don't replicate problematic models that might operate according to different sets of ethics, And I don't think, I really always try to encourage resourcefulness over resources, because, we're in a country, I mean, I'm Canadian, but, the United States has a real lack of federal funding for the arts and for cultural work, and it's a real problem. And you can kind of go the grant route, as Alexandra was saying, but like that can also be really disappointing sometimes and discouraging and incredibly competitive. So what are other ways that you can identify resources that you have right now at your disposal? Maybe it even means like retooling an institution's resources, that you might be enrolled in a school and you could like rethink ways of like reusing the listserv, or, using it as like all of your tools and frameworks for building something else that I think that kind of thinking is sort of where innovation, sorry to sound so techie, like I feel like I'm giving a TED talk, but like that's where innovation happens, right? Like it's where the exciting stuff happens. So yeah, so I hope that's like uplifting and hopeful. trying to end it on a high note.
I think that is incredibly hopeful, and I think some great inspiration as we're kind of heading into the end of the semester for students to kind of think about like, what can they be doing that is outside of their projects, outside of their day-to-day classes, to feel kind of more engaged and more excited about what they're working on, especially because we know we're all kind of facing this Zoom fatigue too. So I think, to both of your points, there are lots of ways to think creatively and be invigorated by the circumstances that we're in right now, and hacking those systems are a great way to do it. So with that, thank you so much again for being willing to have this conversation with us today. We really appreciate everyone joining us as well, and hopefully we'll continue this series in the fall. So keep an eye out for more of these events. But thank you again, and everyone have a great night.